Brian Wilson, Mary Catherine Ham, Brian Neiman, today's newsmakers, and you. The Morning Majority, 630.
WMAL.
8:07 on the Morning Majority, and more info about the Gang of Six plan, such that it is. We're trying to piece it together from what they've offered us. We have James CAPRETTA with us to try and make sense of it. He doesn't sound super excited about it, do you,
not
James?
Not at all, actually.
James, you there?
I am. Good morning.
I wanted to ask you real quick. I want to get your fairly negative view on the Gang of Six plan after this, but I wanted to ask you, because you know a lot about Obamacare as well. Is it significant at all that the Class Act, which was part of the Obamacare bill, is suggested as a repeal in the Gang of Six deal?
Well, that's one of the few positive things I see in the whole package that they released. So, yeah, I think that's a good thing. The Class Act is a small part of Obamacare, sort of a sidecar that got attached to it, but it was going to be very damaging budgetarily nonetheless. It was an ill-advised program that got attached. It's going to have huge long-term budgetary costs associated with it. So repealing it now before it ever got started is a good thing.
Right. Politically, does it mean anything that a group of bipartisan senators got together and said, hey, let's nix this whole giant part of Obamacare?
You know, I think that's a small positive, actually, in the scheme of things. I think you're right. It's a small positive that you got Democrats agreeing to, let's get rid of this thing before it even gets started. Because once it gets started, frankly, it'll be harder to get rid of, and it's going to be a disaster. I think all sides kind of agreed to that. So, yeah, I think that would be a good thing.
All right, but let's move on to the bad. What? Give it to us.
Well, look, I mean, the Gang of Six proposal is really not a lot of specifics. It's basically a process. It basically says, hey, we'll do a small package right away, $500 billion in deficit reduction, probably in conjunction with raising the debt limit, although they didn't say that. And then the big package is to come later. 6 months from now, they're trusting Senate committees to sort of produce a bunch of legislation to change how entitlements work, to change how Social Security works, and also to reform the tax code. And they're saying, in exchange for that, the Republicans should agree to a big tax increase as part of this package. So I object on this on the grounds of, why would Republicans agree to a big tax increase when all of the changes that are likely to be written are going to be written by committees in the Senate that are basically Democratic controlled, especially the Finance Committee.
James, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How do we know it's a tax increase? I mean, if they're lowering the rates and they're getting rid of deductions, how do we know that it's definitely going to raise the amount of taxes that a typical American pays?
It's written right into the document that if you extended the Bush tax cuts on a permanent basis, that would be a certain current policy baseline. And this says, hey, they want to raise revenue above that by in the order of about $2 trillion, according to Paul Ryan's estimates. So that's because they say they don't want the Bush tax cuts extended, so they assume that they're not extended, and then they're going to supposedly reform the tax code at that higher level of revenue. So on net, you're going to have a bunch more revenue coming into the government above what it would be if the Bush tax cuts were extended on a permanent basis.
Well, what about the part where they say they're going to take the highest tax rate and reduce it from, 35 to 29%? Isn't that a positive?
That would be a positive, but there's no guarantee it's going to end up there. Look,
well, your larger point is this is really, really squishy stuff, right?
Very squishy.
Okay, so a lot of legislation is squishy. Can it be squished in the right direction?
No. Once this gets rolling, you're going to have a Democrat writing the tax reform package in the Senate, and what's to say he doesn't come back 2-3 months from now and say, I can't get to 29%. It's going to be 31 or 32 or 33. Once this train starts rolling, it'll be very difficult to stop. Once Republicans are on record agreeing to a $2 trillion tax increase, there'll be no going back.
What about the $500 billion that they say is going to be saved immediately? Is that real money, and is that binding that $500 billion would actually be cut?
The $500 billion is potentially binding only if they put in statutory caps that can't be easily repealed. So I'm not against the initial package necessarily. What I'm against is Republicans agreeing to a very, very large tax increase in exchange for what? Some promises that you might have tax reform down the road and you might have entitlement reform, but neither of which are guaranteed, and both of which will be controlled by Democrats who I don't trust to write this in the right way.
All right. So, what should the Republicans do? I mean, you obviously don't like this plan, but you also say, hey, they're crazy not to raise the debt ceiling because it's going to come back to bite them in the face. So, if you were advising Republicans, what would you tell them that's the best move forward here?
They should be passing right now a small debt limit increase, something on the order of $500 billion, maybe up to $1 trillion. Couple it with a reasonable package of spending cuts, and send it to the Senate to say, look, we're not interested in defaulting on the debt. We're not interested in running up against this debt limit. We're not interested in raising taxes. We can do a package right now that would reduce spending quite a bit, and increase the debt limit quite a bit, so there's room to maneuver here. But we're not going to raise taxes, or I'm not going to let the government run short of its need to borrow money as it needs to. But we're also going to impose some discipline here.
Is there a tax hike in the initial Gang of Six package, like the first thing that would pass and allegedly cut $500 billion? Is there a tax hike in that?
There is. Okay. There's a provision in there called the chained CPI. Basically, that means they're going to measure how they do. They're going to change how they measure inflation, so it will slow the indexing of, among other things, the indexing of Social Security benefits. But it will also slow the indexing of what are known as the tax brackets for the income tax code. So, the income levels that are set to determine if you're in the 35% bracket, those thresholds will go up at a slower rate in the future than they would have. So you're going to have higher tax revenue as a result. So, yeah, it's a tax increase, too.
So right now, as it stands, there are some 15 Senate Republicans who have sort of said we can go with this Gang of Six proposal and move forward. There is an attempt underway right now, one gathers, with Boehner trying to talk some of the House GOP freshmen into going along with this plan. It is the only train right now that seems to have any momentum, the only train that can leave the station. But your position is, and your hardcore belief is, this would be a disaster?
Yeah.
There's no way to fix it or make it better, but if this goes forward, then it's a horrible move in the wrong direction.
This is going to be a huge win for President Obama, number one, and the reason is he's going to get basically Republicans on record to raise the revenue levels of the United States government by huge amounts, at least $2 trillion. Can you imagine, that the Republicans would have agreed to that 6 months ago? Yeah. He's saying that it's going to be in exchange for a reformed tax code that's going to be written 6 months from now. I don't believe it'll turn out anywhere near as good as people are currently expecting. I think it'll end up with higher than a 29% rate, and you're going to still end up with a $2 trillion tax increase.
All right. Well, listen, James CAPRETTA, thank you so much for joining us this morning here on the Morning Majority. We greatly appreciate it. Sounds like we might be back to phase one of this thing.
We're
2
doomed.
steps forward, and we're doomed.